Oh yeah, she once you got her square hands into you, you'd had it. I mean, her Ernest Simpson was her second husband, and Dorothea was his first wife. And Dorothea famously said to her friends, well, she helped herself to my dinner, she helped herself to my clothes, she helped herself to my apartment, and she finally helped herself to my husband. So Wallis liked to help herself.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see so many men here tonight. And would you like to give a round of applause for Deborah's beautiful royal purple dress that she's
Purple velvet. It had to be done. It was in my closet. I thought, what am I going to wear tonight? Purple velvet. Now, Andrew, with this book, you have once again given voice to a royal, a prominent 20th century royal, or royal-ish in the case of Wallis. What drew you to Wallis's voice? Why did you think her story still needed to be told?
Well, Wallis has been written about endlessly, and so has this romance, the great romance of the century. But when I was doing 17 Carnations, which was all about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, their links to the Nazis, and the cover-up by the British and American governments of their liaisons with Hitler and so on. The pages came alive when Wallis turned up. And I knew there was more of a story there, because there was a gentleman called Herman Rogers. This man always appeared as a footnote. He was on holiday with them. He and his wife gave Wallis succor when she came to China. And I always thought that there was something more in Herman Rogers and that relationship, and I wanted to explore that. And it so happens that his granddaughter, Barbara Mason, who supplied these statues, that's Herman there, that's Edward there, she's on the second row. And so when I did 17 Carnations, she very kindly supplied pictures and some of his newsreel videos, and we also discussed, let's look at Herman. But I was also looking at Wallis as well, so I uncovered a whole cornucopia of material, which we'll probably talk about.
Well, that's what I'd like to get straight into, I think, to start with. We'll go through the story as the story unfolds, and it starts with your research, and it starts with those newsreel films, does it? There's an interesting story about getting them from the British royal family.
Well, Barbara had all these films of Herman Rogers, of Edward VIII, or the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, on their wedding day, on their honeymoon, on the yacht Narlin, and foolishly she'd given them to the Royal Collections at Windsor Castle to look after them. So when I was kind of grinding my teeth, saying, "Come on, we've got to get these videos." So she wrote to the palace, and they very kindly agreed to give her the videos back, all in those canisters, and we had to pick them up from Windsor Castle. So we thought, rather than giving my name out, Andrew Morton, that might alert them to what we were doing. My then fiancée, Carolyn May, went and it was like a drugs deal. She picked up this leather pouch full of these old cine films, and you could smell the vinegar from 50 paces, because these people hadn't looked after them very well. So I took them, got them sorted out, and turned into something that was viewable. And it was a fascinating window into Wallis and Herman, who was often behind the camera because he was a great cinematographer. And it showed Wallis in animation, because we all look at pictures of Wallis and think, what did he see in that bird? You know, she wasn't anything much to look at really. But when you actually see her in the flesh, when she's very vivacious, her face is animated, and she's always laughing. There's bubbly laughter coming up. So you could see why she attracted men to her. You could see, and there was a scene on the video that's showing her at Balmoral with Prince George, Duke of Kent, with Earl Mountbatten, with Edwina Mountbatten, with the king himself. And she is the centre of conversation. She's relaxed, she's chatting away. And remember, this was the weekend where a couple of weeks before, she'd said to the Duke, sorry, it's not me, it's not you, it's me, we've got to break up. And he threatened to shoot himself if she didn't arrive at Balmoral. You wouldn't have had an inkling that there was anything wrong. So these videos gave a sense of what was really going on behind the scenes. And then I did more research. I discovered a diary written by a woman called Courtney Spiel. It'd been hidden in a bank vault in Buenos Aires for years because her husband was Felipe Spiel. He was the Argentinian ambassador, and she was concerned that anything that she put in the diaries could lead to their political downfall. And I found these in the Library of Congress. These diaries were a fascinating account of Wallis in Washington and her love affair with Felipe Spiel, this saturnine, very handsome, great tennis player, spoke 6 languages, diplomat. And Wallis fell madly in love with Philippe, until the point where Philippe decided to date another woman, and at which point you saw the volcanic temper of Wallis. She went round to his apartment and cut all his trousers at the knee. And that was an important moment because you realized this wasn't a woman who was just about housekeeping and being moderate. She had a fair old temper on her, as exhibited when she was a little girl, and she whacked a kid behind the head because he'd answered a question before she had, and she had her hands up first. So you got an insight into her character. Now, I'm telling you about the research. So that was a fascinating insight into her love life. And Courtney Spiel, bizarrely, lived a parallel life to Wallis. She was dating Philippe when Wallis was dating Philippe. She had dated the Prince of Wales, who tried to seduce her. She was having none of it. She was dating a man called Jerry Green, who was a diplomat in Paris at the same time as Wallis. You couldn't make this stuff up. It was astonishing. Anyway, I had a bit of a hunch, and the hunch was this. There's a guy called Cleveland Amory, who was a Boston writer, humorist, and he'd been hired by the Duchess of Windsor to ghostwrite her biography. He always appears as a little paragraph in most biographies, and people move on. Cleveland Amory said so and so. And I thought, I wonder if he's got any papers. And so I contacted Boston Public Library. And yes, they did, but they're all in boxes, and they're all away, and you couldn't see them, and so forget about it, goodbye. And that was it. And I spoke to his daughter, and she said, well, I'm afraid I think he lost all his papers to do with the royal family and to do with Wallis. So anyway, I persevered, and I kept contacting Boston Public Library until finally they got fed up with me, and they said, okay, you can go to this warehouse on the outskirts of Boston where we keep all our boxes of files that haven't been annotated. So there's a room. The room was a lot bigger than this. I mean, it was like an aircraft hangar, massive, full of boxes. And so there was my needle, there was the haystack of boxes, and I was looking for something to do with the royal family. And I found that the 166 boxes that Cleveland Amory's secretary had donated to the Boston Public Library. Now, Cleveland, he went from being a socialite writer to being an animal activist. So when you went through these boxes, there are all these books on bison, on rearing wolves. There were bits of reindeer antler, candlesticks. There were golf balls. I mean, any old junk. I mean, what she'd done is put all this stuff in there, and rather than take it to Goodwill, she had sent it to Boston Public Library. Anyway, after about 2 hours of this, and it was a cold February day, a bit like, well, no, today's hot, isn't it? So minus 22. And there's me and this poor librarian there, who was kind of my minder. And anyway, I looked through the list, and it says, picture of man, woman, and child. I thought, all right, okay, let's have a look. So we opened the folder, picture of King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, man, woman, child. So the woman who did the annotation hadn't a clue about the royal family. She was into buffaloes and bison, and I mean, she could identify them, probably knew their names, but she did not have a clue about the royal family. So then, ba-boom, it was a picture of Edward VIII, stripped, half naked, ready to go swimming. Wallis talking to some friends. Wallis in a swimsuit. Great. And then I found this half-written manuscript. I found letters, correspondence. I mean, you know, there was a letter from Cleveland Amory's wife, Martha, to Cleveland Amory's parents, saying, "We've just met the Queen and her two children at Windsor Castle." Just met the Queen, Windsor Castle. Yeah, and it's a lot less formal than talking to the Duchess of Windsor. So I'm thinking, well, all right, where's the interview then? And of course, Cleveland has lost this. I mean, just imagine, you've got the Queen sitting down, telling you everything. But thankfully, there was an interview with Ernest Simpson, where it was once again confirmed that Wallis had a very bad temper, and she was best avoided.
Now you also, I mean, you start right at the beginning. You start with Wallis's childhood and paint a picture of the girl that would become the woman. Her anger, as you say, was apparent very, very early, but there was also sort of an interesting family life. She was part of the Baltimore aristocracy, her family was, but she was sort of a poor relation.
Yeah.
How do you think that affected the way she went about her life as it progressed?
Well, I think yes, she was very much felt she was a poor relation. She felt hard done by, even though her uncle Sol, who was this man from the Warfield side of the family, who looked after her education, she felt he was a bit of a skinflint, even though her mother's side contributed nothing to her life. As a personality, she always used to say there were two sides to her: the Montague side, which was the happy-go-lucky, couldn't care less, live lives like you want to. That's what her mother was like. Then there was the Warfield side, far more solid, businesslike, grave, and matter of fact. And she always felt there were two elements competing in her. I also felt, as I read more of her story, that there was an awful lot of the relationship between her mother and herself. Her mother had quite a cutting, sarcastic tongue, and I'll tell you, Wallis picked that one up. And
the apple didn't fall from the tree there.
But at the same time, her mother was a less hard person. She was more happy with her lot. Wallis was never really happy with her lot, even though she was from a well-to-do family with servants and she could go to country estates. She always felt very much the poor relation, and that informed her thinking. She always felt second class, and so she was always pushing to climb up the greasy pole of social acceptance.
And she was very, very competitive when it came to men too, wasn't it? Even from an early age, even from high school boyfriends.
Yeah, it's funny. Somebody who I worked with years ago contacted me to say, "Oh, my grandmother went to school with Wallis. She couldn't stand her because all she did was try and get boyfriends, and she was notorious at school for having she went to an all-girls school where, of course, everything was far more intense and febrile. And the boys would come down in their cars. And, of course, she had to have the boy who had the Packard. And for those of you who know anything about cars, a Packard is better than a Ford. A Ford are a bit too run-of-the-mill. So she had a boyfriend who had a Packard and was dating her. Or they didn't used to call them boyfriends in those days. They called them beaux. And you brought them a gardenia or a box of chocolates, and that was about it.
And she wanted to marry well. I mean, that was her way of being ambitious. And she did. I mean, her first marriage was to Wynne, and he was, top-notch in the Navy.
Well, Wynne Spencer was an aviator in those days. Remember, he was the 20th aviator ever in history, in American history, to learn how to fly, which is some achievement when half of them fell into the sea. But he was, and in her eyes, he was like an astronaut, and he was just a god. And and the funny thing was, because of all the young men in Baltimore who were wanting to marry Wallis, her mother thought it'd be a good idea if she went and stayed with her aunt, whose husband was in the Navy. And what could go wrong? Florida, sunshine, many white uniforms, and a flying base. Of course, she fell for this chap, Wynne Spencer, within a few months was married. And she wanted to get married, not because she was madly in love with this chap, but because she wanted to be the first. And she wanted to go around Baltimore with the ring on her finger saying, look at me, I'm the first one to marry.
And she ultimately divorced him. He was cruel. He had his own issues. She married again. And what I found fascinating is we've got this woman who, from all accounts, is, as you say, vivacious, appealing. Men fall over her. And there is some question as to either of those two marriages were even consummated.
Well, she always said to Herman that they weren't. She always said that they were never consummated. And she always said that she never allowed a man to go below the Mason-Dixon line, wherever that is.
Which is strange, because to be a vixen and to be so lacking in sexuality is something that we wouldn't expect.
Yes, but at the same time, you've got the passion she felt for Philippe Espiel. I mean, even at a distance of 40 years, when Cleveland Amory, in his ghosted manuscript, was writing things, she was crossing them out, saying, no, he was a man of no consequence, which means he damn well was, because she fell wildly in love with him, and it was, and one would think that was consummated.
It's interesting, because she fell for these men or went after these men, and she got them.
Oh yeah, she once you got her square hands into you'd had it. I mean, as Ernest Simpson was her second husband, and Dorothea was his first wife. And Dorothea famously said to her friends, well, she helped herself to my dinner, she helped herself to my clothes, she helped herself to my apartment, and she finally helped herself to my husband. So Wallis liked to help herself.
But then she got quite tired of them. I mean, there's the two marriages are one thing, but there were affairs of sorts with all sorts of men. Appel, Green.
Yes, I mean Philip Green. Jerry Green was a diplomat in Paris who chased Wallis and offered for her to come to Peking, where he'd just been transferred, and that coincided with her being asked by Wynne, her first husband, to make a go of it, and he was then running a gunboat up and down a river in China. So she went off to China, ends up in Beijing, in the old Peking, where it was a riotous time. I mean, those days there, it was just you were one woman
and
with 20 men paying court. So you know, you were a Cinderella and midnight never came.
And she met Edward.
Yeah, and her take on this, meeting Edward, it's very interesting. And the reason why Cleveland Amory gave up being a ghostwriter, because he felt that she was a liar. And she always told the story that she first met the Prince of Wales at a country house party, where his opening gambit was famously, "Oh, as an American, you must find it very difficult with the lack of central heating in these country houses." And she looked at him and said, "I thought the Prince of Wales would come up with a better sentence than that." And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Everybody comes up with that. I thought you'd have come up with something more interesting." Now, just imagine saying that to the Prince of Wales. Now, I ask you. I'm sure most of you know members of the royal family. As the Queen once said to me, "Andrew, you should never name drop," but I'll say. But when you do meet the royal family, you don't behave like that with them. So the alternative was given by Lady Furness, who was at that time Edward's mistress. And
now I'd like to interject here because I was going to ask that as the next question. So American royalty figures very heavily in this book, being the Vanderbilts, for example, and Furness was a Vanderbilt, and she was also Edward's longtime mistress.
Yeah, well, her sister, Gloria...
Such a small world,
It is a small world, yeah. It is a small world. Well, Gloria Vanderbilt married into the Vanderbilt family. Thelma Furness and Gloria were twins,
Okay.
and they were groomed by their mother for marriage, sex, and men, really. They weren't allowed to go out in the sun in case their skin got burnt. They weren't allowed to do exercise because it might affect their plump arms. They weren't allowed to do anything other than be prepared for a life of seduction.
Well, it worked.
So much for the Me Too campaign. Anyway.
And so Wallis entered this world with Furness.
Yes,
with Edward.
What happened was that Wallis was living in London, and she hated London. She hated the weather. She hated the people. She hated all these the coinage, the old places, and the people with poor teeth, and couldn't understand what they were saying. Anyway, but she started a little salon where she was entertaining people, and she came into the orbit of Thelma Furness. And one of the things she said to her Aunt Bessie, who was a fixture in this narrative, was that I'm going to meet the Prince of Wales one day. That's my goal. And she set herself that target, and she went after it. She became friendly with Lady Furness, and in her telling of the story, back to the radiators and central heating, in her telling of the story, the Prince of Wales came to her house one day while she was entertaining a bunch of people. One of the few people that she hadn't met was Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson curtsied, said a few words, and he moved on, and that was it. That seems far more plausible to me as a way of being first introduced. But she inveigled herself into this network of minor aristocracy, royal mistress, and minor royalty, and eventually was invited to Fort Belvedere, which was the Duke of Windsor's, or rather the Prince of Wales' country home.
Now, what comes out in all of this is Edward's neediness, his weakness, particularly his neediness with women. I think we'll start with that. That drove so many of his decisions.
Well, he was incredibly needy and very nervy. He was always fiddling with his ties and fiddling with his cufflinks and things. In fact, Thelma Furness, his mistress, had him learning how to do needlepoint, so he's got something to do with his hands. He was always agitated. He could never settle to read a book and there was something quite driven about him, but not driven in any particular direction.
Which is bizarre because he's meant to be king, so you would think he's got a pretty clear direction set out for him.
Last thing he wanted to be was king. He kept saying, I mean, if he came in here for a drink now, sat down, he had a shtick. I don't want to be king. It'd be boring. It's terrible. I hate all the idea of printing. And he would even tell gossip writers that he'd met at parties about this thing. So he never really showed any kind of enthusiasm for his future career.
So, but he showed a whole great deal of enthusiasm for Wallis. Now, I wonder, did Wallis give him a way out of having to be king?
I think so.
Was it a good excuse to not be king?
It was a great excuse, wasn't it? You seem like the victim in this. You say, look, if you don't let me marry who I want to marry, I can't possibly do this job. And it's a small thing I'm asking of you. You're able to have home, hearth and family. Why not me? So from his point of view, that was a way out. But also, remember, he was planning to speak to George V. And people forget about this. George V died very suddenly or unexpectedly. And people expected him to go on for a few more years. And what he had in mind was speak to his father, say he wanted to marry Wallis, and then take a second-tier position inside the royal family. Rather like a Prince Harry, like sixth in line, just second tier. And he never did that. He never approached George V. And another point I'd like to make as well is that George V is always seen as the innocent party in this. He knew exactly what his son was thinking because Scotland Yard detectives were following him. And they were following Wallis and Ernest because they thought that they were being blackmailed, thought that the future king was being blackmailed. So nobody was being honest at any point in this whole saga. Not Edward, not George V, certainly not Wallis. Everybody was playing their cards like this, and nobody was giving anything away.
Throughout all of this, Herman Rogers was there. Tell us a little bit about him. He is the one person in the book that Wallis says the only man she ever loved, which is sort of the big takeaway from this book. It's the bombshell that nobody was expecting to hear. Tell us a little bit about Herman Rogers.
Well, I've mentioned the role of Barbara sitting there modestly, but Herman was someone, Yale University, rower, rode for his college, rode for America, handsome, upright, the perfect man that you'd want, well-read, Renaissance man, lived in upper New York State. His next-door neighbors were the Roosevelts. His godmother was Sarah Roosevelt, FDR's mother. So from a very well-to-do family. And he married a lady called Catherine. They went to China, went to Beijing, went to Peking, lived there, bought a temple, as you do. And then Wallis comes into their lives, and and Wallis had met Catherine years before in San Diego when she was there as a Navy wife, a Navy pilot's wife, and they asked her to come and stay with them, which I have to say was kind of courageous of Herman's part, and Herman and Wallis became very, very close. What you might call an avuncular relationship, but nonetheless quite an intimate relationship, where she would talk about, as I've mentioned, never having gone to bed with her first husband and Mason-Dixon line and so on. Mm-hmm. The kinds of things that you wouldn't really talk to a married man about if you were single, unless you had a bit of a interest in what was going on. And they stayed in touch. They became good friends, and he was there at all the key points in her life, on the voyage of the Narlin in 1936, up to Balmoral in 1936 when the king was threatening to commit suicide, and then the abdication comes around, and Herman writes to Wallis and says, come out to the south of France. We have a villa here. That she knew it well. She'd stayed with them a lot. And so there's this nightmare journey through the south of France at a critical moment. And that critical moment is when Edward is making his mind up about abdicating. And so she goes down and stays with Herman in the south of France. Of course, there's no mobile phones in those days. I mean, the phone connection was shocking. She couldn't speak to the king. The king was making these decisions. He was blindly going on towards abdication. She was telling him on the phone, and those phone calls were being tape recorded by the French Secret Service, and I got those comments. And so he was the man who was by her side during this period. And when she wanted to escape Edward, he started to arrange a ship to take her to China, to get her away from this drama, because she knew that she would be painted as the blackest woman in history, and she was getting mountains of hate mail, and to the point where Herman stopped sleeping with his wife, Catherine, and started sleeping next door to Wallis.
Now the thing about Wallis is, she didn't want him to abdicate. She didn't want Edward. She wanted the crown. She wanted to be. I mean, if she hadn't slept with any of the others, she wanted to be the Virgin Queen, didn't she?
Yeah. Well, yeah. She wanted to star in The Crown. She had a gig. I mean, it's very interesting that Cleveland Amory's daughter remembers from being a young girl, Cleveland saying adamantly, all Wallis wanted was to be queen. And why shouldn't she? I mean, it was all a hoot. She thought the whole thing was hilarious until the music stopped and she was left holding the parcel, and that parcel was Edward VIII. But before that, she in those days telephones, were in public places. So she'd be in Paris with her friends, and she'd hold the receiver out so that the whole hotel lobby, could hear him going, "Oh, darling, I miss you, I love you," all that stuff. And she was just kind of guffawing about it. She treated the whole thing as a joke, but a great joke, because she got diamonds, she got bracelets, she got sapphires. It was smashing.
Her jewelry collection was pretty legendary.
It was legendary before they got married. So, and she never wanted him to abdicate. She wanted to be queen. Not that anybody else did, but what did she know of the Constitution? What did she know about the British Constitution? She didn't. She was an American.
See, this is the thing that comes across.
She couldn't even spell Leicester.
Or pronounce it. This is the thing about the two of them, is their shallowness that is sort of mind-boggling when you read about it. They cared about nothing. They were bored. They were the idle rich, particularly after he abdicated. He was directing the Bahamas for a while, but they were the idle rich. They did nothing but throw dinner parties.
Yeah.
Nothing with their lives. They could have done so much.
They could have done so much. I mean, when you think about it, after he abdicated, he and the Duchess were the original jet set, even before jets. I mean, they were the original liner set, whatever you want to call it. They went from Paris to America, back to the south of France.
And they were bored out of their brains.
Edward
was.
They were. I mean, what somebody who saw them once said that all the former king has done is watch his wife buy a hat for the day. They were married, and Herman gave them away. But before they were married, there was a curious incident. This came up in the paperwork I discovered in Boston Public Library. The notes that Cleveland took with a conversation with Herman Rogers. Basically, Herman Rogers being approached by Wallis late one night when Catherine and and Edward were away, and saying words to the effect, "I love you. If I get pregnant, it will be seen as his baby." So you think, wow. So she offered to have Herman's baby, and it was quite an extraordinary admission. And that backed up with the fact that the only man who was a man to her was Herman. Mm-hmm. And when Herman remarried in 1950, the words that came out of Wallis's mouth to his second wife were, Herman is the only man I've ever loved. Now, those 7 words must have been honey to the ears of Edward VIII, to the Duke of Windsor, who's given up the greatest empire the world has ever had for this woman who didn't really love him.
And this woman who had a tongue as sharp as it gets. There's one line, and again, hearing a man who was king say this, "Oh, will I go to bed in tears tonight?" is shocking. He put up with her nagging, and in some ways he actually went after it. It was a sign of what that was the only attention he was going to get. So.
Yeah, he always was very careful of her. He always was very, he looked after her. And in fairness to Wallis, she was in public. She would always refer to the Duke, call him Sir, curtsy. But away from when the doors were closed, and when they no longer needed to act, it was a different kettle of fish. And she had quite a sharp tongue that she'd inherited from her mother. And there was a kind of, I don't know, there was a housekeeper, Mrs. Manvers, or Miniver, is it? Remember that film? Anyway, whatever it was. There was like an S&M relationship, really. It seems to me, and Edward kept coming back for more, year after year, and even when she was humiliating him with Jimmy Donahue, a notorious homosexual in New York, and Woolworth there, who would have a few glasses of wine, then take all his clothes off. And
he was a bon vivant.
He was a bon vivant, and she was attracted to him, and she spent, endless hours in his company, telling her husband, "Buzz off, mosquito." I mean, just what a way to treat the former king and emperor.
Now, toward the end, he was. They had apartments in Paris, and he became ill, and she lost even further interest. You managed to meet the woman who acted as his nurse toward the end of his life, and you found out some very interesting things about the way their relationship was at that point.
I have to say,
the serendipity of the things you found out is astonishing.
I always think that fate takes a huge part of my work. I mean, it was fate that I met Barbara. It's fate that I met Julia Chottard. Now, she was the nurse who nursed Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, in his final hours. Where in the world would you think she lived? She lived about 10 minutes' drive from Oldfield School, where Wallis first went to school. So I could go there and then go see Julia. Also, bizarrely, she was a friend of mine, Una Toffolo, who some of you may remember that in the Diana book, she was Diana's acupuncturist, and it was Una's husband, Joe, who had a heart attack, and Diana came to see Joe in hospital and saw Hasnat Khan, the heart surgeon, fell in love, and the rest is history. So it was an incredible intersection of fate. So I was sitting, and we were kind of blown away by this, even during the interview. And I was talking to her, and she said, yeah, the corbeaux, the rooks, came outside the bedroom window on the night that he died. And they kind of come to take his soul away. And even now, telling the story, the hair's going up on the back of my neck. She said, and all these birds gathered, and they started crowing. And then his breathing got more and more shallow, and he called out, "Wallis, Wallis, Wallis, Wallis." And he died in the arms of a woman from Baltimore.
Who wasn't Wallis.
Who wasn't Wallis. Who was the wrong woman, right city.
It's so
Isn't
sad.
that? It's so sad and kind of poignant, really.